Can I first get your reaction to this news that Iceland has now issued this license to their one and only commercial whaling company for a hunting license for the upcoming season?
Well, it's very disappointing and sort of a retrograde step by the Icelandic government. We were hopeful with the temporary suspension last year that we were beginning to see the end of Icelandic whaling. I think that is still true, but regrettably the government has had to issue a quota for 128 animals for this coming northern summer. Whether any of them end up being killed is an open question, but it certainly was a step backward for the government to continue to issuing permits in 2024. It's absolutely nonsensical.
Well, as I understand it, the license has been granted after consultation with an independent advisory group that recommended improved and less cruel process in terms of killing the whales. I also understand that the commercial whaling will now have to be under more stringent regulations with increased monitoring. So obviously, you think these recommendations don't go far enough.
Well, what the monitoring has thus far demonstrated is that it's impossible to kill a whale humanely in the water. It's an inherently cruel practice that has no place in the 21st century. That's been repeatedly demonstrated in Iceland. We welcome the tighter measures and the monitoring on the vessels, but it's proven what we all have known for some time, that this is a practice that needs to end.
Last year, as you mentioned, Iceland suspended whaling for 2 months, and then they allowed it to resume after a thorough review of the industry practices. You were quoted as saying at that time, "This is a regrettable but required step towards a permanent end to Icelandic whaling." You also say that the end is near. Why do you say that?
Well, we're seeing a steadily dwindling hunt for products that nobody needs and that Icelanders are not interested in eating. I saw your piece on the hot dog eating contest. If there were an eating contest for fin whale in Iceland, all the Icelanders would lose because they don't eat fin whale meat. It's exclusively killed for an export market to Japan. And Japan, frankly, isn't interested in Icelandic whale meat either. This quota, which unfortunately was issued, is much smaller than previous quotas, and it's only been issued for a 1-year period as opposed to 5 years, which is the typical quota period. So we welcome that decrease in the number of whales targeted and in the period of time allowed. That's an important signal, but the best quota would be 0.
So all signs seem to point to the fact that the Icelandic government does want to shut down this industry.
Yes, and that's been true for the previous 2 fisheries ministers, the previous prime minister. In fact, Christian Lofsson, the stubborn lone whaler that continues to ask for these quotas, was quoted after this decision in Icelandic media as saying he wasn't going to go whaling this summer, that the decision comes too late. He's not able to hire staff or put in place the logistics in order to go. So these 128 whales may have a reprieve this summer, which would be very welcome.
Now, a recent survey showed that 51% of Icelanders are opposed to commercial whaling. Why do you think that number is not higher, given, you know, the global pushback against whaling?
I think the global pushback against whaling is part of the reason that you see that. A lot of Icelanders are not pro-whaling, but they're anti-whaling. Iceland, like other countries, doesn't appreciate being told what to do by foreign voices from outside. So there is a sort of nationalist impulse in certain conservative political circles that takes over and has Icelanders defending a practice that even they don't believe in. But it's an important migration for a majority of Icelanders now to be supporting a whale conservation agenda, and a lot of the opposition to the whaling has begun coming from inside Iceland. The decision to end whaling ultimately must be made in Reprieve. It's not going to be made in Canberra or Washington, D.C., where I'm sitting, or London. It needs to be made in Reprieve, and that day is coming closer with every step.
You know, Patrick, Iceland, Norway, Japan, they're the only countries that have continued whale hunting. Give us a picture of what global demand is for whale meat.
It's negligible. In Iceland, as I say, there isn't a market for the whale meat. In Norway, they exclusively kill one species of whale, the smallest of the great whale species, minke whales, for a shrinking domestic market. In Japan, thanks to leadership from Australia and other governments worldwide, has ended its high seas and so-called scientific whaling in 2019, and now has a collapsing coastal hunt for animals just near its shores. So the world is finally moving on. More than 30 years after our parents adopted a global moratorium on the practice, whaling is finally fading out even in those three countries and being overtaken by responsible whale watching, a practice that is delivering benefits in coastal communities right around Australia, obviously, but even in Japan, Iceland, and Norway. Iceland itself is known as a world whale watching capital. That's where the future lies with whales and human prosperity, not by rewinding the tape and sort of bringing whaling into the 21st century is certainly not the way we want to go.